Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
The race had already been defined, many times over. Really, it had been seemingly set in stone for years. And then, over the course of a month, it wasn't. By now, of course, you know that Kamala Harris has all but secured the Democratic nomination for president in the wake of Joe Biden's decision to step back from the race. What is still to be decided, however, is just about everything else. How will Harris fare as a candidate? How will the Republican Party try to define her, and will it work? How will she use her prosecutor's background to attack Donald Trump? And how has she seemingly been able to energize a base that had spent months moping towards a likely defeat? Oh, and do you, in fact, think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. This is The Big Story. Melissa Haussman is a political scientist and a professor at Carleton University, where she focuses on American and North American politics. Hello, Melissa.
Good morning.
What was your first thought as somebody who spends their time studying American politics when Biden announced on Sunday that he would step down? What went through your mind?
Personally, I was relieved because, frankly, I was one of those Democrats who questioned his ability to win, and these repeated statements that only I can win, which is a real huge assumption. I'm a huge supporter of women in politics, so I'm absolutely thrilled that Kamala Harris was in the position to take this up. And we know that this has been a long haul in the Democratic Party. For example, Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman elected to Congress in 1968 from New York, ran for the Democratic nomination for the presidency in 1972. She won 152 delegates, and then there were some backroom machinations between the guys who controlled the party, and she ended up releasing her delegates. 1984, Geraldine Ferraro was the VP nominee under Mondale, and the Democratic Party blamed her for losing the election, which was ridiculous. Mondale was not a very strong candidate. Hillary Clinton ran for the nomination against Obama in 2008. And as we know, in 2016, Hillary was the nominee, some say much to Biden's chagrin, and actually way outperformed Trump in terms of number of votes by nearly 3 million. But of course, due to the Electoral College, the Trump campaign's better playing of the Electoral College math, she lost. So all that by way of saying women and women of color in the Democratic Party have had various shots at the prize, i.e. presidential nomination, but it's a very tough row to hoe. One thing I think that's very heartening is that Harris raised, as of yesterday, over $100 million, which sounds like a lot of money, but it's small in the general scheme of things in a U.S. election, but still very good on fundraising. So there's a lot of positive energy around this.
Certainly, the GOP has been making comments to the effect of how unfair this is and how undemocratic it is to switch nominees this late in a race.
That's a very interesting point, and I'm glad you raised it. Donald Trump has done something that was not done on as large a scale, i.e. infiltrated state-based parties and gotten MAGA-favoring and election denial-favoring people to take over state parties, particularly in big, important states. Michigan was one. He got the Republican Party in California to change the primary rules when he was running to be nominated. He has done really unforeseeable and unprecedented things in terms of taking over state political parties. And then, of course, as we know, took over the national party, pushing out Ronna McDaniel, who was Mitt Romney's niece, and installing his own relatives and one of his close associates, shall we say, as the RNC chair. So they are really in no position to be talking about what's undemocratic, given that Trump has basically eviscerated the Republican Party as an historic, vigorous party organization and turned it into basically a one-man show.
You mentioned the amount of money that Harris raised in such a short time. You mentioned that number is, comparatively small in the grand scheme of things, but how much of a difference could the fundraising excitement around Harris make in the race?
It could be huge. Elon Musk has, of course, committed to sending $45 million a month to a super PAC, which is basically there to run ads. And that's where the fundraising for Harris could play a big part, to run these ads to counter the ads on the Trump side. I mean, being able to buy media time is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing, of course, where the fundraising can help, if it's not donated to a super PAC, which again can only run ads, is in supporting and fleshing out state party organizations and giving the money to hire paid canvassers and people to do the phone banks and all that. I mean, every bit of this costs a lot of money. Texting platforms cost a lot of money. I mean, it's like 23 cents for a short message or something.
Right.
It's just like cha-ching, cha-ching.
In terms of how the GOP must shift their campaign now that they're facing a different nominee, what challenges does now pivoting to Harris pose to them?
I think very large, to be honest. We know that Harris has already been going against Trump, as she did in Milwaukee yesterday when she was talking about her record as Attorney General and prosecuting attorney in California. And she said, this was a really succinct little clip. I know his type. And she talked about prosecuting for-profit colleges. And of course, Trump had one, and prosecuting sexual predators. And of course, Trump has been hit with a civil suit and had to pay out millions of dollars. J.D. Vance, I don't think really has a very good handle. He seems to have been assigned, at least now, the role of attack dog against Harris. He doesn't have much really in ammunition. There are multiple faces to J.D. Vance. We all know about Hillbilly Elegy and his very tough upbringing. But since that time, he went to Yale Law School, and his wife also went to Yale Law School, was a very successful attorney. And the other piece, which knocks down Vance's working class hero bit, is that he worked in Silicon Valley, and he actually brings lots of Silicon Valley tech money to the Trump campaign. So again, the guy's a millionaire, and he's got important connections to the tech sector. So in some ways, this election is going to be very interesting because historically, California is the biggest part of fundraising for the Democratic Party in recent years, not in a small amount because of former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her prowess as a fundraiser. But, now Vance has access to that through Peter Thiel, Silicon Valley big bucks guy who's been promoting Vance. I mean, the other piece is, to be honest, Trump really has no ability here to run a racist campaign, although I'm sure they'll try, because Harris is of partially Indian heritage, but so is J.D. Vance's wife. She's, Indian American from the country of India. So that's going to be a tough one to try to sell, I think, in terms of using racism. Doesn't mean they won't try, but I don't know that it'll gain any traction.
When we talk about racism and sexism, how much of that will Harris have to overcome in the months ahead if she's actually going to pull this off?
People have said more and more over the years, particularly Democrats. I mean, the Republicans have been pretty bad at electing women. They say they're willing to vote for a woman, but of course, who knows what happens in the ballot box.
Right.
Another heartening piece is that, of course, we have record percentages of women and African Americans and Latinos and Latinas, Asian Americans, et cetera, in Congress. And the Congressional Black Caucus, which, again, Shirley Chisholm actually helped to found, but was male-led for many years, that's become much more, not completely, but much more helpful to women and supportive of its female candidates. The thing that's really, really important here, I mean, Black women are very good at turning out. They're much more energized from what we hear, and particularly young Black women, a lot of them in colleges are members of what's known as the Divine Nine, various Black sororities. Harris was a member of a sorority at Howard. And so all of this is very important in terms of networks and turnout. But the Democrats do have to work on some white women, although, again, white women have been energized in certain states like Florida and across party lines by the abortion issue, because It's just been such an incredible field day for anti-choice organizing since the Dobbs decision in 2022. So the candidates' organization has to work very hard, and I'm sure she'll get lots and lots of interested volunteers, but it's about getting those folks to the polls.
What could Harris do now to shore up support and perhaps take some chunks out of the undecided column? The big issue, I guess, that I want to ask you about before you go is the VP pick. Who should she be looking at? What's out there?
Well, again, most of that is driven by electoral college math. And so Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania is, I think, a front runner. Again, I'm speaking completely in the dark. I don't know anything. I don't have any information on it, but I know that he's basically a key pick. Another one that seems to be running very favorably in the Veep stakes is Andy Beshear of Kentucky, for whom I have a great deal of respect. He rolled back the punitive workfare for Medicaid, which is the health care for those below the poverty line that the previous Republican governor had implemented, and he's quite clearly progressive. They're also talking about Governor Roy Moore of North Carolina, who is a former state attorney general like Harris is. So each of these people, brings their own policy benefits to the table. But Pennsylvania and North Carolina in particular would be important states to win. Some people have talked about Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. I think a lot of people fear that 2 women on the ballot would be just too crazy for the U.S. electorate to handle. I'm not one of them, but of course, middle America might feel differently. So that could be an issue, but she could prove me wrong and pick her. What do I know?
One last question.
Sure.
What's at stake here for Canada?
The U.S. has not been playing well under the USMCA with regard to the auto industry, and we know that's hugely important for Canada. On the other hand, Canada and Mexico took the U.S. to the USMCA tribunal, and the U.S. lost. So there wouldn't be much of a difference. The only difference is, of course, Trump is talking about levying a 10% tariff across the board on all imports, which would very likely not survive WTO challenges. But for all intents and purposes, I don't see much change between the Biden administration and a Harris administration. I mean, Harris, when they were negotiating it and Pelosi was Speaker in the House, she got some provisions that made it more palatable to Democrats to vote, things like improved worker protections, some environmental protections. And that was good enough for Biden, but basically it was not good enough for Harris. And she was one of 10 senators to vote against the USMCA based on saying the environmental provisions weren't strong enough. So I think some folks have a worry there. I mean, Harris comes from California, which we know is the 5th largest economy in the world. So she's not inherently anti-trade. I mean, she's clearly pro-trade and was allowed to take that position on the USMCA because they had the votes anyway. So it's about shoring up one's particular policy record, but I don't see her as an anti-free trader by any stretch of the imagination. She is a pragmatist. That's how she got to where she is. So I think probably continuation of the same.
Melissa, thank you so much for this.
Thank you very much.
Melissa Haussman of Carleton University. That was The Big Story. For more, you can head to thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can shoot us some feedback. Let us know what you thought about this episode. I am particularly curious in hearing from our listeners about how much they want us to cover American politics. Do you come to us because we stick to Canada? Are these issues big enough that we better pay attention wherever we live? What do you want to see as we move into the 100 days that will decide at least America's future? The way to do it, as always, email hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or phone by leaving a voicemail at 416-935-5935. The Big Story is in all your favorite podcast players and all your least favorite podcast players. And it's on smart speakers if you ask them to play the Big Story podcast. Thanks for listening. I'm Jordan Heath Rawlings. We'll talk tomorrow.